I'd like to welcome Jerod from CData. Hi, Jerod, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks for having me, Sean.
Thanks for joining me. Jerod is from a company called CData, and we're going to get into all about what they do and why it works with Servoy. But before we do that, I want to just kind of talk about what's on the agenda for today. As you know, if you've been in this tech series before, we always start with a few demos. And CData is a company that's all about connectivity. And was it probably 2 weeks ago, Jerod, we got into contact, maybe 3 weeks ago, into contact with each other and sort of put together a little proof of concept to see how CData's technology and Servoy's technology could work together. And yeah, that went pretty well. And I got pretty excited and said, well, we have to do this for our next webinar. So that's what brings us here today. And the demos that I'd like to show are just some example use cases. One is going to be connecting to Salesforce platform. The other one's just going to be connecting to my Google Drive service. After a few demos, we'll get into some more use cases and kind of how it works. So, oh, by the way, this webinar is recorded, so you can always access the recordings on our archives. And there is a questions panel in your GoToWebinar console there. You can just type the questions in and we'll do a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So please ask questions as they pop into your head. Don't be shy. Alrighty, so I'm going to go into my Servoy IDE and I'm going to launch the NG client and bring up an example solution. The first thing I'm going to do,
so
yeah,
real quick, we've got somebody saying that they can't see the screen.
they can't see the screen. Okay,
but it looks like they left.
But you can see my screen, Jerod?
I can see your screen, yes.
Okay, so and we're getting confirmation.
There we go. Okay, yeah. Okay, there it is. Confirmation. Thanks.
Everyone can. Okay, thanks guys, and thanks Jerod. I've done that more than once, believe me, where I start talking and no one can see my screen. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click my Salesforce accounts link here in my little demo solution that I prepared over the past couple days, and I'm listing some records that are coming directly from Salesforce. And this is for those of you that are familiar with Servoy, this is just a typical kind of table view with some search functionality, and I'll click through it in a minute. What I want to do is show you real quickly how I set up the connection, and then we'll come back and click through some of the functionality. So I'm going to go into, just ignore that. I accidentally tried to launch Servoy again. I'm going to go into my database servers setup here, and I wonder if it's because I accidentally clicked this. No, that's not it. It's, I think, refreshing the schema. Jerod, you may remember that when we were setting this up before, the Salesforce schema is quite big, and when we first make a connection, it refreshes the schema, and periodically, I think the IDE can refresh the schema. So I think that's what's happening. Well, this is a fine start to the demo.
Yeah, but I mean, you're right there, Sean. It is going to point to, so it's pointing to the Salesforce API, and every endpoint gets exposed like a database. So depending on how large an API you're working with, it can take some time to refresh everying.
Just see if there's anything, and there we go. It was just refreshing. Okay, I was panicking and checking the log. I expanded the database servers node, and it was Servoy developer, as you guys probably know who have experience, caches the data model up front so that once you start working with it, then it's faster. So now I'm going to double click and open up the Salesforce connection. And this is just like any other JDBC connection. And that's why I got really excited when I first started talking to Jerod, because Servoy is primarily connecting to relational databases with JDBC, and we have all these nice features that are built into the platform that are very mature with data binding and some productivity for querying and caching and searching and all that stuff, which has been fantastic for many years to work with just relational databases and flat files and things like that. What CData does is they make drivers, and including JDBC drivers, that connect to lots of other stuff like web services and other platforms. So what I've done is I've taken one of their drivers and I've dropped it in my drivers folder. When I start the Servoy developer, that shows up in a list of available dropdowns. So I select the driver. I got some configuration advice from Jerod, including username, password, and a security token from Salesforce. And once I make that connection, it exposes the full schema of the Salesforce backend. Now, mind you, that's a platform with probably a REST API, but I'm seeing it like a database. That means I can search through the entities of my Salesforce without having to write, HTTP code and handle authentication and all that stuff. It just works for me. So let's take a look at some of the features you might expect from a Servoy application. One thing that I wanted to do, one of the first things we did when we did a little proof of concept, is just connect and kind of scroll through and check the performance and then see what I was sort of expecting there to be problems with queries and the kind of queries that Servoy generates, because we generate kind of standard SQL. As I scroll through, you can see that the lazy load kind of thing that Servoy usually does on a database also applies with these drivers. Now you can imagine if you were writing the code yourself to connect to the Salesforce API, you have to manage like the paging and the caching, and that's done without writing any code here. If we look at the database performance for that, I should probably clear these and do it again. Well, now it's all cached, so now we're not going to see any queries if I scroll. Well, let's just scroll really far. We'll probably get some reloads. There we go. So now you can see I'm loading in chunks of records, and looking at the performance, it was pretty performant. I called that 4 times with an average of 127 milliseconds. So this really feels just like connecting to other data sources in the way that Servoy developers typically do. One other thing that I want to point out is when you connect to a data source, any data source in Servoy, and you check the enable procedures option, then it will expose any internal stored procedures that the database might have. Well, lo and behold, there are things, of course, in any sort of platform API that are not necessarily entity-based, and CData's drivers expose those as procedures. So, and we have an example of that coming up, but you can just see that there's quite some procedures that get exposed as well from Salesforce through the driver in a way that I can call directly from Servoy. And as you know, Servoy added about 1.5 years ago a nice feature that exposes the procedures and includes data binding and maps the data types and stuff for you. So so that works really nicely. And we have an example of that coming up. Some other things that you might see in a typical application are, say, searching. So I'm going to search for electronics companies, and you can see the search was pretty quick. I'm using one of the search API's Servoy extensions that allows you to do text-based searching, and it generates SQL for you. That gets sent to the driver, and you can see that there is this custom search here, and I used the default search all columns. So there's a lot of columns on that table, and it does case insensitive, and it's a lot of OR. So it's a fairly complex query to find any records matching electronics or a string fragment of that. The other thing that I would point out is that I'm going to go to the data source for accounts. I created, this morning I made an aggregate on account called record count, which just counts by ID. And you'll notice that up here I have 56 matching records. If I clear it and hit enter, I go back to the original 570. So I also wanted to test some other SQL constructs. And if I go to the query here, you can also see there's that aggregate. So the where clause with the aggregate with the count ID is generated as well. So I'm really I was doing a lot of stuff to throw a lot of neat things at this driver. Another thing that I want to point out, all the typical Servoy constructs are available. So there's an aggregation. I also wanted to check out relations. So I made a few relations. One is contact to account and account to contact. And I made another screen here with contacts. And you can see that I'm showing the related account here. So that's not in the primary table, that's in the foreign table. But also if I were to search by account, okay, now I've broken it. Let's see if we're hitting it. Real quick. No, I'm not hitting it for some reason. So I wanted to show that it generates a join across the driver, but I think if you've seen a lot of the webinars where we talk about searching, the searching can generate some really complex queries. And I really was playing with this and trying to get it to search with joins and everything, and it really just worked just like I was talking to a database. So that covered a lot of the stuff like aggregates and complex queries like joins. The other thing that I wanted to do, I was able to make a value list as well and do things like lookups. So let me show you editing because that's another unique feature. So I'm going to come into one of these records by double clicking. And so now you can see the detail record here. This is Edge Communications, a company that I have in the Salesforce backend. What I'd like to do is bring up that same company here. So this is now looking at the Salesforce Console. And there's Edge Communications there. So back in the Servoy application, I'll just rename this Edge Communications Inc. and click out. And so what that actually did is it submitted it to the driver as an update statement, and the driver went and sent the appropriate commands to the Salesforce API. And if I probably go into the detail here, maybe I have to refresh it. There it is. Edge Communications Inc. So now it's been updated from the driver. And if I look at the queries here, you can see that I have the update account down here. So it changed the account name for me. So you can update through the driver, insert, etc., and it exposes all of that to you. So really, it's just like building other Servoy applications. One other thing you might notice here is there's a map, and I wanted to show the idea of a calculation, which is another concept in Servoy. So the map is on the contact detail screen, and if we look at, it takes a minute to load. It's always a bit slower when the meeting is presenting. Not the contact detail, knucklehead, account detail. I wanted to feed the map coordinates to where's the map? That's on the shipping tab. It's in a separate form. I did a tab panel. I wanted to show related records, which I'll show in a second as well. So here's the shipping form, and you can see that the data provider for the marker is coming from map address, which was a calculation that I made on the table. So another way to look at this would be to go back to that account table and look at calculations, and there you can see the map address. So that's just concatenating a few of the properties, but you know that the data binding for the map works so that, you know, if I were to change this from Austin to Houston, the map moves, you know. So if I'm getting different data back from the website, from the Salesforce service through the driver, then you know, the calculation is gonna run. And so everything that you normally do in Servoy with all the data binding features, it really just kind of works. Another one is the relation that I made with the account to the contact. So this is now showing that I have two related contacts on this account. And if I go to, you know, some other accounts, you can see I have other related contacts. So pretty much if you have experience building applications in Servoy, it really feels like you're talking to a database. It's wonderful. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to show with connecting to Salesforce, except for that the little search here didn't work, but it was just to show that I could search a contact based on their account, which generates a join. But it's just not calling. I don't have the method hooked up, I think. But rather than debug that in front of you, I'll just keep moving. The other example that I really wanted to show you was a different service, Google Drive. And the reason I want to show this is to explore the stored procedures type thing. So I'm going to go back into the IDE here, and I'm going to bring up, first of all, my Google Drive configuration. And you can see here, all I did was give it a server name and give it the URL and a bit about how it authenticates. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But just that it was this easy to set up the connection after I had taken the driver from CData and put it in my drivers folder. It exposes a few of the entities here as tables, but what I was interested in is looking at some of the procedures, and I'd like to upload a file. So I can see that there's upload file there. And so I tried it out. And what I did is in my form called files, I think, I'll just open that and show you the upload target. So I handled the method or the event for the on file uploaded. And what I want you to pay attention to is this line here, line 27, because that's where I'm sending stuff to the driver. So in this case, I got the bytes from the file, and I call this this procedure. But keep in mind, and this is not an often used feature of Servoy, so maybe I'll actually type through this for you. But data sources dot, and then the data source type is SP, stored procedure, and it'll go and find any data sources that have enabled procedures, and those are the two that I've enabled. And after Google Drive, it lists the procedures, and if I'm looking at upload file, you can see it gives me the parameter and the data types that it expects. So it was that easy to try it out. Also, there's some really nice documentation on all of the procedures of all of the drivers on the CData documentation website. Jerod prepares a lot of really nice knowledge base articles and documentation. So let's try it out. I'm going to go here. I'm going to click. I'm going to just grab this log file. and it uploaded it to Google Drive. And so you can see that I did hard code a folder ID here, and there it is right there. You can see that it was just uploaded 1 minute ago. And this is the folder ID. So I kind of just hard coded that in because I knew, but there's a whole API and entity way to work with Google Drive. The point here is not really the Google Drive stuff. It's just that it was that easy to run a stored procedure. So I hope that makes sense about the stored procedures. But I was really pleased to see that because it just makes, I mean, I don't have to deal with any REST, any HTTP code. Even the authentication was handled, and that brings me to the next topic. You may have wondered, how did I connect to my Google Drive and not someone else's? Because if you look at the Google Drive connection profile here, it doesn't specify any token or anything like it did for the Salesforce one. I had username, password, and token, and here it just says initiate OAuth is the get and refresh. So what happened is the first time I initialized the connection pool, I went through the OAuth step and I authorized that account, and now it's stored the credential and automatically refreshes the credential, and the driver manages all of that. It's really, really nice. So what I'm going to do is kind of clear the authentication, and I think there is, it stashes the credential somewhere on my server machine. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that, and I'm going to try to reinitialize the connection pool here, and it should kick off the authentication. So now it's you've probably seen this using any other applications that rely on OAuth for another service. What it's saying is, do you want to allow, in this case, CData Google Drive connectors, the registered app, and that's the one that's sort of sample one that's hard coded, or I should say, built in as a default to the driver. And Jerod, you can correct me if I misstate that.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah, so most people wouldn't do that. They would probably register their own application with Google or with whomever you're connecting to, and have the authentication be white labeled for their own use. And then I picked the account that I wanted, and then it talks about the scope, the OAuth scope, which is what are the permissions that you want to enable, and I click allow, and then I'm done. And now those connections are pre-authorized, and this will work. Now that happened when I initialized the connection pool. So that would be kind of strange, because in a production environment, that happens when the application server starts. Fortunately, you'll notice on the procedures that there's always these OAuth, for the ones that require OAuth, there's always these OAuth, I can get the authorization URL. I can, through Servoy, there's a simple API to show another URL, and I can do that and get the token back and the callback and all of that. So that's sort of the custom way that most people would do it, but for the sake of the demo, I just left it at the simple OAuth, the one that's built in. Okay, so that kind of concludes the demo part. What I'd like to do is talk a bit more about who CData is and how they can bring value to business applications. So I'm going to turn it over to Jerod. And Jerod, if you could just kind of give us a quick, hello world statement for CData, and we'll get into some use cases and kind of the underpinnings of what we saw technically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I really feel like I don't really have to say a lot. I feel you covered kind of how CData works and what we offer really well. So thanks for that, Sean. So CData Software, we're a leading provider of data access and connectivity solutions. And our motto is really, we want to let customers see the world as a database. And the way that we do that is by providing SQL access through standard drivers like JDBC to data sources that are not databases. So your online applications, your web services, NoSQL data stores, big data stores, even like directories full of flat files, regardless of what the data source is. As far as a developer is concerned, as far as a user is concerned, it's going to look like a database. So if you want to jump to the next slide, we can kind of see what that looks like as a picture. So this is just kind of how this works. So your applications, that's going to be either what you're building in Servoy, or if you are doing some analytics or ETL or anything like that, they can often already connect to relational databases. They already speak SQL, so our drivers plug in, we'll translate the SQL query into the API request or the wire level protocol, depending on kind of what data source is going on in the background, and get the data from the backend data source. So from the web service like Salesforce, from a directory of flat files, whatever the case is, and then by the time it makes it back to your application, it looks like database data. So you're able to process it and do all of the database functionality that Sean talked about. So joins, aggregates, defining relationships, filtering, selecting specific fields and things like that. So we can jump to the next slide, and we'll take a look at some of the data sources that we support. So this is not an exhaustive list. I think we're pushing 150 now, but you can see some of the popular ones. There's a lot of data in the Microsoft ecosystem, whether you're looking at the Dynamics 365 world, or there's the Google ecosystem we have a lot of access to. So Gmail, your AdWords, your Google Analytics data, SaaS applications like Salesforce, HubSpot. You're even looking at point of sale software like Square, or accounting software like QuickBooks. But the list goes on, and I could take another 20 minutes to try to rattle off the rest. But instead, why don't we talk about some use cases, so typical use cases for CData customers. So kind of I don't want to call it the primary, but this is the one I think that gets the most visibility, is it provides BI enablement on your software as a service data. So Salesforce, QuickBooks Online, other accounting software like Xero, instead of having to replicate that data into a database, you're getting direct access to it from your BI tools. So you're able to do data and analytics without having to replicate your data.
So what you mean is, like, if I wanted to mash up, data from my QuickBooks with all the custom data in my application and see it as in kind of like a unified analytics, I can just do that as another database table.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And so then the next one, and this is basically what we're looking at here, is ease of integration for developers. So instead of having to write the integration, instead of having to implement some kind of REST client that's able to consume a REST API, you simply talk to a data source like it's a database. So instead of learning the API, you simply need to know SQL, or be working in a tool or platform that speaks SQL like Servoy, and you get basically instant drag and drop access to your data. So another use case, and this kind of encompasses the first two, is embedded connectivity. So if you're like an enterprise tool developer, instead of having to outsource that connectivity or having to require your customers to replicate their data, you can just provide live connectivity to all of their data from within your tool. And so this would mean putting the JDBC drivers inside of a tool that you build. And then kind of the last use case is broader data access for specific tooling. So there's a company called Bouquet.ai, and they have a tool that's called Eris, which is short for Aristotle, and it's a tool that allows you to transform natural language into SQL queries. And so then they can do some AI and analytics based on that. But they could only talk to databases. So they're translating, like a question like, what was the highest rated customer for Q1 in 2019? And they'll translate that into a SQL query. I mean, you can imagine that SQL query is very complex, which is fine if you're talking to a database, but they didn't have a way to do that and talk to something like Salesforce or QuickBooks or HubSpot. But with the CData drivers, now that SQL query gets translated by the driver into the API request, and then they can be processed and dealt with just like database data.
Yeah, I think that's that's the most compelling thing that I saw too, is that I mean, in Servoy, developers all the time are making a quick. I mean, we have the grid that I was showing can turn into a pivot grid, and just with a few clicks can start to do some analytics and aggregations and some really powerful stuff. And that could be on any data source. And I think that
Right.
I mean, obviously the example I showed kind of looked like the same screen that you get in Salesforce, and that the point is not to rebuild Salesforce, but you know, to access these data sources like they're a database. And I think that that's just intuitive for Servoy developers, and it takes some of the features in Servoy, like the data binding and the SQL generation, and it just empowers that capability to new levels. And so I think it's pretty compelling.
Yeah, no.
Let's get into the bits and bots of it. Can you talk about how it works and
Yes, absolutely. So I mean, you covered a lot of this, which was great. But you know, we'll put it all together. So the CData drivers work by modeling data access through SQL. So typically, we're talking to a REST API that's going to have endpoints, and those endpoints typically correspond with some sort of resource or entity. So you know, Salesforce account, Salesforce contact, Salesforce opportunities, and the list goes on. Anything that can be read from and written to is going to be exposed as a database table. Anything that is read-only, and these tend to be like reports or you know, like modified times or different entities like that. Those are going to be surfaced as views. The individual objects within a table or view or individual object within the platform. So a Salesforce account, a single account will correspond to a row. As you demonstrated, a single contact will correspond to a row. And then you also demonstrated that those sub-collection relationships are maintained. So each contact is associated with a specific account. Each opportunity is associated with a specific account. If you're talking about invoices and invoice line items, those relationships are maintained. So the concept of foreign keys exists, even though you're talking to an API. And then the way this all really works itself out, which again you demonstrated, is that your CRUD operations, so get, put, post, merge, delete, those are all going to be translated to a corresponding SQL statement.
Right,
So
right.
Get becomes select, you know, delete becomes delete.
Yeah, and I had to read
update.
some of your documentation on Salesforce, and more so on the Google Drive stuff. And as I was poking around, I was really impressed with how consistent the sort of the semantics are, that from driver to driver, it really is. It's not like there were odd quirks or exceptions. I imagine that you guys are probably encountering odd things in API. You know,
Sure.
not every REST API is really well designed, and even some big platforms have some oddities in their APIs. But you guys kind of handle that internally. Do you ever get some situations where, I don't know, an entity has some data in it when you read it, but if you try to update that data, you can only update certain columns? How do you guys handle that, and what is the developer experience like?
Yeah, so you know, we will try to read kind of whatever metadata is available from the API. So a lot of these APIs will have some sort of metadata query that you can get information about the API, and it will give us information about which columns are read-only and which ones are write-only, and then we can kind of surface that in the database metadata as well. So in a database, you know, certain columns might be read-only. We surface that just like a database would. So it does exactly what you said. It kind of gives that uniform experience across the data sources. So as far as your tool is concerned, as far as you're concerned, you're just talking to a database that has the same kinds of structures and limitations that a database has, but on the back end, it's just translating that API. And then, so the quirks and the kind of weird things that show up, these are these operations and functions that you demonstrated as well. So the idea of uploading a document, well, that doesn't really make sense in the context of a database. Like, you're not going to say like insert my file into my Google Drive folder, because the Google Drive folder may not necessarily be a table in the concept of pushing bytes of data file data into a database doesn't always make sense.
Right.
And so when that happens, we'll surface those operations and functions as those stored procedures. And that's more or less the way that we get around anything that doesn't really translate into a table or a view.
Mm-hmm. Nice. I encourage, let me see, do we have questions here? I'm going to leave up this, we're getting a number of questions. I'm going to leave that slide up, which has some information here for useful links. First of all, what I want to do is, as we start to get some questions in here for Jerod, is to sort of announce that CData and Servoy are going to continue this partnership because it feels really natural, and I think it's a win-win for both companies. And for you guys, what that means is getting more connectivity in Servoy applications in a way that you're used to working. So I'm pretty excited about this partnership. And if you're already interested right away, you can contact me directly, or right there, sdevlin@servoy.com or sales@servoy.com. If you want to check out what's available, they have this nice website with their list of drivers, and they do this nice categorization too. So I know that like a lot of our customers are interested in for example, accounting or e-commerce. Like they have FedEx, UPS, and USPS and Shopify and Stripe and Square and all that stuff. Whereas some of our other customers, they do need to talk to big ERP and CRM backends. So go ahead and check in there to look for if certain connectivities you want are supported. And the next time you think about connecting to one of these and reading their service documentation and all that, just remember that you don't have to. That it's possible to do it in the same way that you used to programming in Servoy. So I'm going to leave this slide up, and let's get to the questions, Jerod.
Yeah, sure.
Well, all right. So there's a lot of them. That's good.
Yeah.
I've seen in the website that CData has a 0 driver. Can I use that driver to post get invoices like I would do with a REST request?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's exactly what it does. So all of the functionality that you showed, Sean, for Salesforce, you're going to get the exact same kind of functionality with 0. Okay.
And what if you wanted to use a Google Drive account per tenant in your solution?
So that's going to mean you'll need multiple connections. So you can kind of set up the authentication to authenticate with different Google accounts based on each database connection that you set up. So you might have multiple connections that are using the Google Drive JDBC driver, but each of them can point to, in the end, a different Google account.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I should say that that's a good question to segue on. CData and Servoy can work together to ensure that you're getting the experience that you should out of other drivers in the Servoy platform and the way that it's used. So part of this partnership is a technical partnership as well. I think just in the little POC that we did, we found out some little oddities about the way Servoy was using the driver and the way the driver responded, just little things that both our R&D teams were able to work out pretty quickly for this demo. But of course, any sort of technology integration is not without little gotchas. But CData is vendor supported technology, just like Servoy, and you get that assurance when you select vendor supported technology, and so that's another aspect of this partnership. And I could see working with multi-tenant applications and having different service accounts for different tenants and best practices and all of that. It'll just be like the other integrations that you do in Servoy that we support. Another question. What does this cost? Again, you can contact me directly to talk about that. sdevlin@servoy.com. Somebody asked if it connects to Box. I guess that's a yes,
Yep.
right?
Yes, it does. And the experience there is very similar to the Google Drive experience. So you'll get kind of operational data about box, so list of folders, list of files, and then the ability to upload documents or files, download documents and files.
Okay, another question about multi-tenant. So Jerod, you get a picture of the landscape of customers we have. A lot of them do have multi-tenant applications. They have hybrid SaaS and on-premise stuff. Yeah, I think there are some technical implementation challenges there. I don't think it really relates necessarily to the driver itself, more about how Servoy uses it. But I think that we can come up with a model that works for multi-tenancy. In the same way that we have multi-tenant applications that need to use different database connections per tenant for things like multi-tenant Oracle. So I think that should be doable. Another question, another one about Box. Does it connect to Office 365? I think you said there's a lot of Microsoft stuff in there.
Yes, so Office 365 is supported.
Okay, and another one about Postgres. What differentiates your paid driver with the official, free PostgreSQL driver? And I guess the same question could apply to any of the relational database drivers. So our community uses a lot of JDBC drivers for regular databases. Maybe you want to talk real quickly about why CData's drivers might be used instead of typically the vendor-based drivers are free.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a great question. And typically what you're going to see is performance improvements. A lot of the kind of vendor supplied drivers are often open source, which means that they're being developed by the community, which is great. But when you're talking about CData, we're a company that specializes in connectivity, and essentially this means we also specialize in data processing. So the ability to process data as quickly as it comes across the wire, and we often find that we will be faster than kind of the free drivers that exist. So if performance is a concern, then you may want to check ours out. If it's not, then I mean, by all means, use the vendor supplied driver.
That brings up another question. Can you talk a bit about performance? The performance of the Salesforce connections were pretty good. I was going through and looking at all the queries it was making, and they weren't as fast as connecting directly to a database, but understanding that it's translating everything. That Servoy sends, just how I was scrolling through that grid, Servoy is sending, here, there's one thing that I didn't show. In the editing a contact, I made, there's a little construct called a lookup in Servoy, and even this stuff where I can just change it. It was really fast. I mean, I'm doing keystrokes here, and the way this normally works is it sends a query. I don't know why there's all this weird autocomplete stuff there, but it sends a query per every keystroke, and if I type real quickly, it just was humming along and finding the one I want, and then I went and looked at the queries. Can you talk about how the paging and caching works? Because Servoy does sort of the same thing once it's in memory, and then it's also sending queries with like limits and offsets. And I was expecting, when we first got together, I was expecting kind of, maybe there will be some issues there or whatever, but everything just worked. What do you guys do when these services don't really natively support a great way to do that, or does that always work?
Yeah, so it will always work, and then the kind of the performance that you're going to see is going to be dependent on what the API supports. So there are actually a lot of APIs that like Salesforce or QuickBooks or Xero, where you may have hundreds or even thousands of accounts or contacts or opportunities, and the API itself is going to support paging in one fashion or another. Our engineers are going to map kind of the paging that you see with the offsets in SQL to the paging that's supported by the API. And that lets me talk about another thing in that wherever we can, we're going to push processing down to the service. So instead of having to try to churn data in memory, we're going to ask Salesforce to do the data churning. And so that could be filtering. For Salesforce, that also means joining. So there's some functionality in the API that means that Salesforce can support a join. And so we're going to ask Salesforce to do all that data processing, so we're not taxing your resources. And that's especially relevant as we, are as an industry are moving towards cloud computing. So you're not taxing not only machine resources, but you're not tapping into those financial resources by, spinning up more processes to process more data, holding more data in memory, and things like that.
Yeah, so it sounds like you guys really understand the back end that you're connecting to, and that the driver's not just like a REST to SQL converter, but it understands a lot about the inner workings of the platform or the data source that you connect to optimize it. It's not not just a translator kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah. Another question, and maybe this could be our last one because, well, I think we answered all the other ones. This one is about QuickBooks Desktop. What has to be running on the QuickBooks machine? What has to be installed? How is it maintained? Is the QuickBooks connector for the desktop version or the cloud version?
So we have both. So we have a QuickBooks Online connector and then a QuickBooks Desktop connector. And as far as I know, I think there's one other piece that has to sit, like there's a free tool that has to sit on the QuickBooks Desktop machine. It kind of acts like a gateway between the driver and the QuickBooks company file, the QuickBooks Desktop company file, in order to allow you to grant SQL access to it. But that connector is free, as far as I know. So, and I'm happy to provide more information on that offline.
Yeah, that probably would need to be a little bit of an exploration, because that's also, if you're running in a browser and you want to talk to your local QuickBooks, that's also, so maybe that's for Servoy's desktop client. Not sure. Okay. Well, I think we got through all the questions, and that there was a lot of questions, Jerod. That's a good thing. So again, this is recorded. You can email me directly with any questions that you have. Anything that I can't answer, I'll forward to Jerod. Jerod, I want to thank you so much. You did a great job explaining all of this. I can tell that it's resonating with our community already. So I'm looking forward to working with you probably pretty soon. And thanks again, and thank you all. And we'll be posting the recording shortly.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. It was a real pleasure to be here.
Okay. Bye, everyone.